Bill Sullivan is an historian who spent 20 years studying the lost world of the Incas. He believes he has found in the Spanish chronicles of the conquest of Peru a code, and broken it. A code that might even connect the Incas with the builders of the pyramids and of Stonehenge. And with this code, he believes he's unfolded a secret history of the Inca Empire. A secret history which reveals not only why the greatest empire of the Americas was created and why it collapsed, but even why the Incas sacrificed their children. Bill Sullivan believes the Incas left us these secrets as a message in a bottle, because they wanted someone in the future to tell the story of who they were and what they'd achieved. 2 years ago, on a trip to the Andes, Bill found concrete confirmation of his ideas. Fernando Elorieta, unlike most Inca experts, grew up here in the heart of the sacred valley of the Incas. Inca myths and legends were part of his childhood. Fernando, like Bill, was aware that the Incas were infatuated with astronomy. Bill's idea that Inca gods were planets and that the black clouds visible in the Milky Way were the Incas' constellations fitted in with everything he knew. He'd spent 20 years searching in the sacred valley, following clues in the myths, and believed he had the visible proof Bill needed.
I was amazed when I saw Fernando's book, because I had assumed until that moment that the mental world of the Incas that I had been exploring through the mythology, that its major manifestation was in the myths. When I found Fernando's work, I saw immediately that the entire mental map of the Inca world was laid out in the Sacred Valley. He began to explain to me that the animals which are represented as black clouds in the Milky Way actually exist in the valley in the form of huge effigies carved by means of agricultural terraces into the mountainsides. So that the entire Sacred Valley is a reflection of the Milky Way and the constellations in it.
Hay muchas constelaciones representadas en el valle y otras que tal vez todavía no las comprendemos.
There are many constellations represented in the valley, and maybe others which we still haven't found, hidden among the mountains. One day we'll manage to reveal all that the valley contains. So far we found images of the constellations, the condor, toad, llama, tree and the serpent. They're all along the valley.
Están a lo largo del valle.
Constellations for the Incas were the dark patches within the Milky Way. Inca astronomy focused on the Milky Way because, unlike us, they could see its full glory. What Fernando explained to Bill was that people hadn't seen the Milky Way effigies for centuries because they weren't meant for just anybody. The whole idea was to create imagery that was reserved for the initiated who knew how to see it, just like their myths. Fernando told Bill how to look at the land and sent him to the road above the town of Pisac, where, he told him, he'd find a giant effigy of a condor.
The condor was another of the black cloud constellations in the Milky Way. And in this one, the neck and the beak parts are made of agricultural terracing. The whole right side of the mountain is the right wing, and coming towards us, the left wing. And the condor is lifting off, and under its wings are pre-Columbian grave sites. And it's because the condor eats only carrion. It's associated with death. And its function here is as a mythical image carrying the souls of the dead to the hereafter.
The condor at Pisac looms 2,000 feet high above the valley floor, a mile across. At its base is one of the largest necropolises in Peru. At its peak, is one of the Incas' most sacred temples. Its terraces are precipitously steep and impractical. It seems an absurd place for agriculture, given the availability of flat land in the valley bottom.
The terraces on the back and on the neck as well are placed in a pretty precarious spot. They're useful and they're still farmed today, but you can also look at any other part of the mountain and say, why didn't they put terraces there if terraces is what they were primarily interested in? You can see that they're using the terraces as a sculptural element.
Next, Fernando told Bill to look out for an image of a giant toad alongside the road back from the Pisac Condor. An unlikely assignment.
That object there, that hill, is called the Toad, Hampatu in Quechua, and the people who live here call the plain beneath it Hampatu Pampa, and there's a lot of toads down there.
So here on the ground was another of the creatures from the myths. The Toad constellation is known to lie near what we call the Southern Cross. And in case Bill still wasn't convinced, Fernando had sent him to look for a second condor, which overlooked the town of Urubamba.
This one's an old condor, and you can see that he's kind of shoulders hunched. You're looking at his back and he's taking off. I like them both. This one has its own character. But like the one in Pisac, it also has pre-Columbian graveyards right at the base of the wings. There's a certain amount of skepticism that you have to have when you look at these, and of course the one in Pisac is more convincing. This one is almost completely natural, except perhaps for the eye. But yeah, the graveyard's the ringer because it fits in with the mythology we know and with the cosmology, and it's sort of a cross-check.
Last and most important for Bill was the constellation that had been central to the myths he decoded, the llama. According to Fernando, its effigy was in the heart of the sacred valley, overhanging his hometown, Ollantaytambo.
From this vantage point, you can see the head of the llama with the nose pointing to the left, and below the head is the front legs, and there's a big rock outcrop in the middle, and that's represents the fleece of the llama, and the hindquarters and the hind legs are the terraces further to the right.
What Fernando's discoveries show above all else was the commitment of the Incas to their ideas. The sheer manpower required to sculpt gigantic effigies into the sides of the mountains gave Bill the solid proof that the characters in the myths were important to the Incas. For the first time, myths, astronomy, and artifacts on the ground had come together. But it was Fernando's last discovery that was the most extraordinary.
Well, the first time that I climbed to the vantage point where your eye can resolve the image of the pyramid was on a June solstice, and all I could think of was who built this, and what an amazing thing it is to build an invisible pyramid. When Fernando and Edgar first became aware of the existence of this pyramid in the mid-90s, the first thing that they did was to go to their Indian friends here in the valley and said, well, what's the deal with this pyramid? And everybody said, what pyramid? Well, it's about 1,000 feet on a side, which makes it larger than the base of the Great Pyramid in Egypt.
25 million cubic feet, 1.5 million tons of rock and soil, all moved by hand, a feat which dwarfed everything else Fernando found. And all to make a pyramid which from almost every angle you look at it is invisible, just like the myths, just like the effigies. It's remained unknown because you can only see it well if you make the 2-hour climb up the mountain on the other side of the river to lookouts from where, Fernando thinks, the construction of the pyramid was directed. Only from here does the illusion work properly and its full layout, including the terraced sunken fields called windows, become clear.
En una mentalidad occidental podría entenderse que la pirámide está escondida.
Perhaps to the European way of thinking, you could say that the pyramid is hidden, yet it's not, because it's in sight of everyone who understands what they're looking for.
No entenderá de que existe la pirámide.
And to really understand it, you have to know on which day to see it and even at what time of that day. And when Fernando took Bill to the right place on the right day, sunrise on the June solstice, Bill saw how the pyramid too confirmed the Incas' obsession with the stars.
As the sun comes up, it first enters into the window, and then as the beam of light spreads, it starts to move up and points like an arrow up the road. And then the next thing that happens is that it enters the ruins of Ollantaytambo above. And the ruins right there in Ollantaytambo are an enormous effigy of the llama. But in case you thought your imagination was running away with you, the Incas wanted you to know that this was for real, because the only star in the Black Cloud constellation is called the Eye of the Llama, and that's what lights up first here on the June solstice. It's Alpha and Beta Centaurus. It's called the Eyes of the Llama.
Cuando vimos el rayo de luz que iluminaba el ojo de la llama, fue una gran alegría para
When
toda
we
mi
saw the
familia,
ray of light
porque
which
fueron mis
illuminated the
hermanos,
eye
mi
of the
persona,
llama,
los que
it brought
pudimos
great happiness
decodificar
to my
de que
entire
la llama en
family,
ese
because
momento
it
estaba
was my
despertada
brothers and I
y
who had
nos
discovered
sentimos
it.
privilegiados,
It was a
porque
great
así
moment
como
when the
en las
llama
noches,
awoke
la llama
before
está
our
despierta,
eyes.
en el día, en este mundo terrenal, la llama despertaba ante nuestros ojos.
Oh, I think this is a staggering discovery. A lot of the work that I had to do involved reconstructing the mental world of the Incas from their mythology, and now we have it here on the ground. It's staggering.
And it's not just the June solstice. On the December solstice, the rising sun grazes the other face, 1 meter higher or lower, and this wouldn't happen. And on the equinoxes, it strikes the edge. So all the solar alignments are contained in this one monument.
Fernando's really a kind of he's a simple person in the sense that what he really cares about are the people in the valley of which he's a native. And he wants them to feel the power and the dignity of the tradition, which has been largely lost. And he's really dedicated his life to making his discoveries available, not just to some wider public in the rest of the world. He wants people who live in the valley to take heart and to recapture their own tradition.
El legado que esperamos dejar en este mundo, si es que alguna vez volvemos a ser estrellas, es haber hecho de que la gente
The legacy we
vuelva a
hope to leave is
interesarse
somehow
en su sociedad,
to cause
vuelva a
people here to
interesarse en su
become
historia,
interested
y no
again
solo
in their
como
society
una
and their
narración
history,
del pasado,
not
sino
only to see
como
it as
algo
just a
que
story of
tiene
the past,
vigencia,
but
como el
as
despertar
something
de la
that is a
llama,
vital, living
un
force.
espacio que está vivo.
Like Bill, Fernando had evidence that the Incas had been a sophisticated people. Where Bill had found his evidence in myths, Fernando had found his in the mountains where he grew up. Armed with Fernando's work, Bill felt finally he was able to tell the Incas' history of the Incas. The Inca Empire sprang fully formed out of anarchy. 800 years of civil war, had reduced civilization in the Andes into an endless war of all against all. In the early 1400s, the Incas were just one amongst at least 100 clans living in the Andes. They occupied only the village of Cusco and its valley, and were surrounded by enemies.
There was a sort of a systemic warfare that had been going on for centuries, and that each valley was it was sort of valley against valley, and it was said that all the bridges in Peru were cut at the time of Viracocha Inca. There was also problems with shortages. The population was getting higher and higher. There was deforestation going on. That said in one chronicle that raids were staged only to acquire firewood.
And yet, paradoxically, they burst out of their valley, and in 90 years they built an empire that stretched from Colombia to Chile, as large as the Roman Empire. And Bill had no doubt that what lay behind this sudden burst of creative energy would be astronomy. Part of the Inca genius was that they founded their empire on the oldest idea of Andean civilization, that each clan was descended from a star. And just as the different stars moved together in harmony in the sky, so the peoples of the Andes needed to live together in harmony on Earth. This idea had been forgotten in the mayhem of 800 years of tribal warfare, but resurrected by the Incas.
Because I pursued astronomy from the beginning, I think that I found the royal road to the Inca mind, and I think it's impossible to understand the Incas without understanding the extent to which they pursued the cosmological imagery in the sky.
Based on all his research, and what Fernando Elorrieta has shown him, Bill was in no doubt that for the Incas, the beginning of their empire itself would be written in the stars. And he knew that there'd been a prophecy connected with stars, uttered at the moment the empire was founded by the Inca king Viracocha Inca. He thought the first clue lay in that prophecy.
When Viracocha Inca made his prophecy in 1432, he said that after the reign of 5 Incas, the entire empire would be destroyed and its religion laid waste. And I think that you can understand, given the pressure that the Incas were under when he uttered his prophecy, they were about to be invaded by people who said, you know, we're going to dip our lances in your blood. That he could feel that the world was coming to an end, and that the practical circumstances of life that surrounded them, and so many other people in the Andes, justified making a prophecy like that.
As always with the Incas, Bill was convinced that these events on the ground would be related to events in the sky.
And that led me to see what was going on in the sky in 1432. The situation that Viracocha Inca prophesied about was a sort of a visual, physical disconnect between the sun and the Milky Way, which, if it was taken literally, would mean that connection with the ancestors would be destroyed. Now, physically, that means nothing to us, but cosmologically, it meant something to the Incas.
To the Incas' way of thinking, the Milky Way was the causeway between the lands of the gods and ancestors. And when the dawn sun no longer rose where the Milky Way crosses the horizon, its rays could no longer throw a visible bridge down to the Earth. So the bridge, giving gods and ancestors access to Earth, was broken. What frightened the Incas about losing the bridge to the ancestors was that it paralleled exactly the loss of the bridge to the gods that had happened in 650 AD. And that had coincided with the start of 800 years of civil war. Once again, the signs in the sky matched exactly what was happening on the ground. For a people who believed deeply in the message of the stars, they should have accepted that fate was against them and done nothing. Yet the empire was built. This was the paradox Bill had to solve. And at the heart of the paradox was one man, Pachacuti Inca. It was his vision and willpower that set this epic project in motion, Whereas his father, Wiracocha, chose fatalism and surrender, for some reason, Pachacuti chose life. His vision harnessed the natural power of the mountains. The Incas took its water for irrigation, its stone for terracing, and fed an empire of 7 million. After 800 years, the diverse peoples of the Andes, just like the stars, were working in harmony again, as their founding myth prescribed.
The most perplexing problem for me was that Pachacuti Inca apparently rejected his father's prophecy and took over the kingdom from him. He even humiliated his father, according to the chronicles. And yet at the same time, he accepted the prophecy. He must have accepted the prophecy because the last Inca, Huayna Capac, died with the prophecy on his lips. It was passed down through the royal family, we know that. So he accepted it and he rejected it.
Here was an empire that should never have been. For a people who believed in prophecy, they should have done nothing. And we know that for the first 7 years of his reign, Pachacuti did indeed do nothing. Then in the 7th year, something important happened. The thing which precipitated the founding of the empire. Once again, Bill felt sure it would be to do with the stars, and that he'd find it in the myths. And yet again, it's because of the Spanish chroniclers that we have the critical evidence.
And what happened was that I started to read a chronicle by a priest named Murua. Well, Murua was apparently somebody who was sympathetic towards the Indians. And in some sense, I believe that the shamans who came to him must have trusted him. They didn't trust him enough to explain to him what the story meant, but they trusted him enough that he would take it down and leave it to posterity, and this he did. In my opinion, the myth concerning Pachacuti Inca and the beginning of the empire is the single most important document that's come down to us from the pre-Columbian Americas. It's the complete explanation of the origins of the Inca Empire. The myth begins by describing a terrible rain. It rained for 30 days and 30 nights, and it appeared that the entire world might be destroyed by a flood. And then an apparition appeared above the city of Cusco of an enormous man, and in one hand he carried a conch shell, and in the other hand he carried a staff. And so this was a vision of Wiracocha. Then Pachacuti decided to go up above the city and to meet with the vision. And he spoke to it, and he said, "Do not let the world be destroyed by a flood. Do not let there be a Pachacuti," which literally means overturning of space-time. It's the Andean term for the end of a world age. Now that's the story. And the meaning of the story is entirely in accord with everything we've said so far, for example, about the Inca prophecy. First of all, it specifies in the myth that Pachacuti Inca called the apparition of Wiracocha brother. And it also said that Pachacuti Inca was the son of Manco Capac. What that is a reference to is that all Inca kings from the lineage of Manco Capac are the regents of Jupiter on Earth. And when he called Wiracocha brother, this is meant to put him on an equal footing with the planet Saturn as Jupiter's regent. So the first thing that you have described in the myth is a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. The first thing I did when I came across this conjunction was to check it in the planetary tables. And again, it's not so rare an event. There's a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter every 20 years. But it wasn't until I looked at it on computer software that I found what was really going on. And I was actually quite shocked when I saw this, because the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in the reign of Pachacuti Inca took place in exactly the same place in the stars as the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter of 650 AD.
When the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter occurred in 650 AD, it was, according to myth, when the god Viracocha first gave the Incas the right to rule. 800 years later, the conjunction repeated right on the heels of his father's prophecy of doom. Because although the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter happen every 20 years, the pattern they create takes 800 years to complete. This conjunction is what changed everything for Pachacuti. Yes, if the stars continued to move as they'd always done, then the bridge to the ancestors would be lost exactly as his father's prophecy said. Yet he chose to see the repetition of this rare conjunction as reaffirmation of God's covenant with the Incas, in flat contradiction to his father's prophecy. From that moment on, he declared a new world age, the age of the fifth sun, and he set about creating the Inca Empire of the Sun.
Pachacuti was not a fatalist. That was why he could not accede to the wishes of his father, and why, in fact, he couldn't accept the terms of the prophecy. But the commencement of the fifth sun was very odd, because it was born with prospects of only a very short lifespan. And so it's inconceivable that Pachacuti Inca would declare the commencement of a new world age, knowing that everything would be over in a century. And when I realized that Pachacuti Inca knew this, as expressed in the myth of Marua, it finally hit me what his vision was. He conceived the idea that if, as Andean tradition has said all along, as above, so below, what would happen if the people below began to engage in rituals which would ask Viracocha to change the course of the stars? He felt that if there was a connection between heaven and earth, well, by God, the earth had some say in what was going on, and he would organize the entire peoples of the Andes into a single empire with a single goal. The Pachacuti Inca conceived of the idea that he would change the course of history by changing the course of the stars.
So this is what it was all for, this empire, these works. Sullivan believed this was the secret of the Incas. They'd made such efforts to preserve their myths as a message in a bottle, to leave a vision, a map of their beliefs written on the very landscape itself. Taken such care and effort to make sure that we knew that the Inca Empire had been for more than just the comfort and vanity of its rulers, more than brute survival and conquest. This empire and the people who built it had a purpose, a vision, a destiny, to turn back the hand of fate itself.
It's quite possible to view the Inca Empire from the point of conventional materialist historical analysis and say, well, Pachacuti Inca was a genius at inventing rites and customs and practices that would both impress the powerful and hoodwink the ignorant, and that the thought forms that he was working with were a kind of a justification for the creation of an empire, because for whatever reason he woke up one morning and said, I feel like having an empire. But for me, that doesn't catch it, because in the end, I've had to conclude that one measure of a people's sincerity is what they're willing to sacrifice. I think anytime you invest a lot of time in studying some era in history or some people, that you reach a point where you realize that the attempt to keep yourself completely separate and objective cuts off your powers of empathy and connection. And I particularly was concerned about trying to understand how an empire which created as much beauty and was so practical as to turn its stonemasons loose to build beautiful agricultural terraces rather than temples, could at the same time sacrifice children. When I started studying the Incas, it never crossed my mind that I would ever try to engage the question exactly why they did it. But at a certain point, as this research gathered momentum and as these myths seemed to open up and speak, there came a time when I felt that I did understand why the Incas used human sacrifice, and I'll say that for me, it's extraordinarily poignant. The Capacocha ceremony was the ceremony which involved human sacrifice. It involved first an inpouring from all over the empire of tribute of all kinds, but including 1 or 2 unblemished children, about the age of 12 on down to perhaps 7 or 8. The children to be sacrificed came from, no more than 2 would come from any one tribe, and we know that each tribe was descended from, ideally from a different constellation. From all the accounts that we have, the number of sacrifices was strictly limited to 500, and the ritual was performed either every year at December solstice or every 4th year.
The Incas never gave up hoping that the prophecy would not be fulfilled. Never gave up hoping that the stars could be stopped. But the heavens never did stop.
The children were sent back in the direction of their homeland. And the descriptions say that they walked in, as far as possible, undeviating straight lines to the horizon. Well, the significance that the children were sent back to their homelands is that their purpose in being sacrificed was to bring a message back to the homeland in the stars. And in fact, the words that are used, there's an alternate word for human sacrifice, and it was called kachawi, which means message or messenger. The children were literally messengers. And we know from other descriptions of Andean religion that if one wanted to make a plea to God on high, one made it through one's homeland, not directly to God. And so you have a picture of children of all the tribes in the Andes related to all the stars in the sky, being sent to their homeland, being sacrificed at their place of origin, being sent home to the stars, each with the same message. And this message quite literally constitutes the secret of the Incas, because the word Capacocha literally means the secret plea or business of the Inca. And the prayer that the priests uttered as the children were led back to their Waka homelands was, "May the sun and moon stay young," meaning may the age of the 5th sun remain young. May the world not turn over, literally, ama pachacuti, May space-time not flip over. May a significant precessional event not occur. And may there be peace. But with an entire empire conquered and at peace, this raises the question about where was the war? And it highlights the fact that the practice of the Capacocha, the sending of these young children back to the stars, was really the second and most important front in Pachacuti Inca's war against time. Because only if these children could return to the starry sky and through the intercession each of its own star, get that star to make a plea directly to the man who had his hand on the mill Wiracocha, that would stop and that the world would not turn over.
The bridge to the ancestors did, of course, break. And in 1532, God gave the Incas his answer. The Spanish arrived. In the Battle of Cajamarca, 7,000 Incas were slaughtered in a single day. Within 50 years, 5 million were dead. The whole of what we grandly call the Spanish conquest was to the Incas nothing but the closing scene of a tragedy long since foretold in the stars. The Incas had one last surprise for Bill Sullivan. When he looked at attempts to decode astronomy from myths from other civilizations, thousands of miles away from Peru, and millennia older than the Incas, he found the code was the same as the Incas.
The issue is whether or not people traveled and whether our ancestors were connected to a much wider and a much more widely distributed civilization than our history books now tell us.
Bill was confronted now with a bigger story even than he had found so far. Could it be that the Incas' astronomical knowledge was a glimpse back to a time when ancient peoples traveled across seas and continents, taking with them their fascination and expertise with the stars?
The astronomical cosmology that the Incas had and the techniques that they used to encrypt and transmit the information that they were gathering about the sky is no different from the techniques that you find in the Vedas, in the Egyptian pyramid texts, in the myths of Sumer.
If people were traveling in ancient times, the question was, how far back did it go? Were the Incas a last vestige of a culture which existed before recorded history began, and of which we are only now recovering the first traces?
I think the Inca Empire was the last culture on the earth operating fully with ancient cosmological principles, which may already have been old when the pyramids were built.
What had alerted Bill to this larger story was finding the Inca code cropping up elsewhere in the world. But he'd also found that there were things from those distant cultures in the Inca myths.
One of the early chronicles was a complete list of all the 5 visible planets with their Quechua names. The characteristics might as well come from a schoolboy's notes on Greek mythology. Jupiter's the emperor, Saturn's the father of time and fierce, Mars the god of war, and so on.
junto con cerámica, y el otro es estructuras. Porque hay que tener...
Once again, what Bill found in the myths, Fernando showed him on the ground.
Algunas partes,
Y más tarde también.
sí. Hay...
Right in the middle of the Lama and Pyramid complex, overlooking Ollantaytambo, is a monument that Bill felt implied cultural exchange between the New World and the Old.
The first thing is the utter strangeness of a 150-foot-high image of a gentleman with a beard. Now, of course, that corresponds exactly to the myths from the time of the conquest that were collected, that the god Huiracocha was a tall, bearded stranger carrying a staff. It also goes without saying that native South Americans don't have facial hair.
It wouldn't make any sense for the Andean god to have a beard, except that in the myths Huiracocha is connected with the planet Saturn, and that all around the world, Saturn is depicted as an old man with a beard.
We still to this day have an image of Saturn as Father Time, and he carries a staff and he's old. In his grim aspect, he's the Grim Reaper. Well, in Andean mythology, the creation of the world took place under the auspices of a tall, bearded stranger who carried a staff. Well, I understood immediately why mention of this is dropped in the academic literature, because it runs absolutely counter to all anthropological theory that ideas could have traveled over that vast of a distance. I mean, the rules in anthropology is, here's the Greeks, there's the Atlantic Ocean, there's Amazonia, there's the Incas, and ain't no way the two are going to be talking to each other.
As extraordinary as this conclusion from Bill's work may seem, it has found support.
Check that.
Professor David Kelly is one of the world's most respected authorities on ancient history, one of the men who decoded the Mayan hieroglyphs. He's a recognized expert in South American history, astronomy, and mythology. He's also published works on the possibilities of ancient seafaring.
I have been interested in the history of watercraft for much longer than I've been interested in the history of astronomy. I was working on watercraft actually when I was in high school, and that puts it back 60 years now. So I've spent 60 years looking at these kinds of problems. And having looked at them and looked at the kinds of watercraft that are available, I think that the idea that there was no contact across oceans because of the watercraft is a straw man. There was an abundance of capable watercraft. If you can travel 20 miles by watercraft, you can probably travel much, much farther with good luck. I think that there will be very major changes in our understanding of prehistory over the next 20 years. There were contacts back and forth between different parts of the New World and with cultures outside the New World, and probably contacts which had influences in both directions. I think they've been in contact across the oceans for at least 15,000 years. That's putting it earlier than a lot of people would like to.
So the reason that Bill Sullivan has found a match between astronomical knowledge in Greece and Peru could be because the knowledge crucial to seafaring people would be knowledge of the stars in order to navigate.
Archaeologists are very practical, and they're not going to draw conclusions about contact between peoples unless they see trade goods. But on the other hand, that kind of betrays our own sense that the only kind of activities worth taking on are economic ones. And completely banished from this picture are people who would travel to explore. There is a Looney Tunes school of ancient history, and it's very convenient for mainstream academics to be able to have people like that in order to lump people like me with them. It makes it permissible for other academics who are not quite expert in the same field that the critics are to have permission not to read the book. And that's the problem. You know, if I could ask my critics one thing of them, I'd ask them to read what I've written.
And one of the few scholars who has read Sullivan's work is Professor Kelly.
When I first read Bill's manuscript, I was struck by the fact that he was able to take a particular mythic event and show that that event occurred at a particular time on the basis of at least 6 different techniques of analysis. It wasn't that he was reaching the same answer or reaching one answer and then fitting a whole bunch of things in. He was actually able to demonstrate the same date chronologically on the basis of his analysis of different aspects of the same myth. To me, this particular myth, which gave these different ways of getting to the same result, that's impressive stuff.
We cannot write a book like the book I've written and not expect there to be things in it that are just flat wrong. And I'd rather that half the things in the book were right than only a quarter of the things in the book were right. But certainly if at some time and in some place, the people who were expert in these fields were to take the time and go through it and sift out what was worthwhile and take that as a base to maybe take another step from, I'd be very happy. I really consider myself a very lucky man. I found something that I was passionately interested in, which is the possibility that our past is more rich and more accessible than we know. I think it's correct to say that the Incas were the last living branch of an ancient tree. And it may be that the greatest Inca legacy will be that we will return to our own past with fresh eyes and learn that we, all of us, come from a common culture. We people of the 20th century have almost no clue about the nature of our past, and how ironic it is, since these records, which we call myths, are lying around in libraries gathering dust unstudied.